and welcome to the Haddonfield United Methodist Church Weekly Sermon Podcast. For more information about us or anything you hear in this episode, be sure to visit haddonfieldumc.org. We hope that this and every episode can help sustain you on the journey as together we seek to put our faith into action.
Hi friends, welcome to our sermon podcast. We are in Palm Sunday weekend, concluding our Lenten sermon series, Follow Me, Profiles of the Disciples of Jesus.
It is said you are the company you keep, but what about Jesus? He spent time with outcasts, with sinners, with religious people, with the sick, and with foreigners. We can truly learn about the love of God by looking at how Jesus called from his eclectic community and renewed their lives. Join us this Lent in profiling different followers of Jesus and find your place among his diverse community of disciples.
So we are celebrating Palm Sunday and the story of the Palms this weekend. And I'm going to read a little bit of an extended story. We're going to be in the Palm Sunday story, but we're going to veer outside of it to profile the last follower of Jesus that we're looking at in the season of Lent, and that is Judas Iscariot. But John chapter 12, verses 1 through 19 says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume, but Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. As it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written of him and had been done to him. So the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify. It was also because they heard that he had performed this sign that the crowd went to meet him. The Pharisees then said to one another, "You see, you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him." Well, perhaps you are well acquainted with the story of Palm Sunday, which was the second part of that passage. The well-known story that appears in all of the Gospels of Jesus coming to celebrate the Passover on this day, about to go down the hill and cross over the Kidron Valley and then up the mount in which the holy city of David, Jerusalem, lies. And then Jesus enters into Jerusalem. So Bethany is a hill or a mount that kind of overlooks Jerusalem. And so as he descends, crosses over, and ascends, this gathering of people forms, and they start to wave palm branches and they shout this funny word, Hosanna. It is important to remember that unlike what I learned or believed as a kid, Hosanna does not mean yay. It does not mean yay, Jesus. It means save us, please. Hoshia, save us, na. We beseech you. We beg you, God. And it comes from a psalm that says, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Save us, please. Hoshia, na. So these people are gathering around, not just praising Jesus, but literally asking him to save them, to provide a new future for them. And here in John's gospel, he gives us a particular view of who has gathered and why they have gathered. It's not just because they heard of Jesus healing or that they were of the crowds that he fed of the 5,000, but particularly he performed this last great miracle, which was he raised Lazarus from the dead. It is important to note that the stories of Jesus take place primarily in two separate regions, two former separate kingdoms. The kingdom up north, which used to be called the kingdom of Israel. In Jesus' day, it was Galilee. That's where he's from. And then every once in a while, a couple times a year, he goes south to the former kingdom of Judah. The area now is called Judea, and that is where the temple of God is, the city of David, in Jerusalem. And so there are different accents, there are different politics, and there are even different Roman rulers in charge of these different states. So in this story, Jesus is not with his people in Galilee. He's now kind of in foreign territory. I think about a metropolitan area, New York or another great city where Wall Street is, kind of the center of trade, the center of culture. He's down in that territory. And Jesus is not from there, so he's not particularly beloved or welcomed by the elites who live in the city. So Jesus has just done the unthinkable, and that is bring back someone, his friend, follower, Lazarus. He brings him back from the dead. Word spreads like wildfire. And the people begin to amass, not just because they heard of Jesus of Nazareth, but they heard, oh my goodness, did you hear about the man who brought back Lazarus from the dead? Well, people in that day, particularly who lived close to the temple, would have been well aware of writings of the Old Testament prophets that speak of God's Messiah, the one that God would send to restore the city, like King David, would have special power, special abilities to see the future and even cause the dead to live again. So people's hopes were building, and finally they project this Old Testament hope in the Psalms and the prophets. Jesus, whose name is Yeshua, salvation, save us, please. Rescue us from the Romans. Kick them out. Get rid of the corruption. Restore Israel. Restore Judea to God's reign. Make all well in the world again. Huge expectations being heaped upon Jesus. But there is one character in all of the gospel stories who I believe is the MVP of the Passion story. Outside of Jesus, there is one person who is the most important and most central character of the entire Holy Week story, even, one would argue, the Easter story. It's not Mary, it's not Peter, it's not John, it's not even Pontius Pilate. It's Judas Iscariot. If there was no Judas Iscariot, one would argue there would be no crucifixion, there would be no resurrection, the whole story would be different. So we want to look here in just a few minutes at profiling, as we've been looking at different followers of Jesus. What do we know about Judas? And what can we learn about Judas? And what does his story have to teach us about being a follower of Jesus? I know he's a weird or strange choice on Palm Sunday as we get ready to celebrate Easter in 1 week to lift up. But it is important to learn the lessons of Judas Iscariot. The Hebrew name, Iscariot, is a city in Judea. It actually means two cities, and it is a town to the west of the Dead Sea, south of Jerusalem. And Iscariot would have been the Greek name for Judas and understood to come from the Hebrew ish, which means man, Iscariot, man from Iscariot. Other scholars say, we're not so sure that that's where the name comes from. Some people say that it's very close to another Aramaic word that means man of the dagger. That Judas is the one with the dagger who stabs Jesus in the back or betrays him. There's another Hebrew word that literally means to deliver or to hand one over. So perhaps some scholars say that Judas is seen as the betrayer, the one who hands Jesus over. I would say the majority of scholars, however, believe that this is derived from the town that he comes from. So the one thing we know about Judas before we get into the Passion story is that he's not like the other 11 who are all from Galilee. Judas is the only Judean boy, the only guy from down towards Jerusalem. So maybe he didn't fit in with the rest of the crowd. Maybe there were differences. He was the only person. His name in Hebrew would have been Yehuda, literally Judah. The Greek and Latin would have called him Judas or Judas, but in Hebrew he would have been Yehuda Iscariot, Judah of Iscariot. And so Judas, we learn a few things about him. Number one that is very important is whether we like him or whether we don't like him. The Gospels, especially John, constantly reminds us the one who will betray or the one who was a devil. But Judas was, first and foremost, called by Jesus and was included in one of the 12. That's really important to remember, is that despite his shortcomings, Jesus handpicked him and invited him to follow. The second is, as I mentioned, he's the only disciple from Judea, from the southern country, or the former kingdom of Judah. The third is that he was trusted for whatever reason. It said that he held the bag of the treasury for the disciples, whatever money that they got if they needed to buy food or other things as they traveled. Judas held the treasury. But according to the Gospel of John, we also know that even though he was trusted, he wasn't necessarily trustworthy. He was a thief, according to John. Another fact that we know about Judas is that according to the stories of the Last Supper, Judas sat right next to Jesus. So even though, again, he's given a bad rap, has a devil, betrays Jesus, he was not on the way edge. He was on the left side, immediately next to Jesus. So he's close to Jesus. He's included. He is chosen by Jesus. So Judas is a part of Jesus' inner group. The next fact that we know is that Jesus knew Judas would betray him. In several of the Gospels, Jesus says ahead of time, one will betray. In Matthew, everyone says, well, is it I? Who will it be? Is it I? And then Jesus predicts the one who dips his bread in the cup next to me is the one. So Jesus foretells. So he suspects and knows that Judas is going to betray him, which leads us to another fact, which is, despite the fact that Judas is about to betray Jesus, he is not excluded from the table. This is very important. Judas is not excluded from the table. Jesus knows what he's going to do, but he still welcomes him at the table. That's always been a head scratcher to me. Why wouldn't Jesus just change the location and not tell Judas? That's what we would do today, right? The other fact that we know is that Judas, of course, then after the supper gets up and leaves before the other disciples, and he betrays Jesus for an amount according to one of the prophets, Ezekiel, in the Old Testament, for 30 pieces of silver. That is the price he's paid by the guards of the chief priest of the temple, 30 pieces of silver. The other fact we know is that the way that Judas betrays Jesus is a kiss. He tells the guards that when you come and find me with him, the man whom I kiss on the cheek will be Jesus, which kind of gives us an idea that maybe Jesus isn't as widely known as one would assume, because there has to be some sort of a sign of who Jesus is. And then, a little bit of a plot twist, Judas regrets what happened after he sees that Jesus is arrested and beaten and is set to be executed. Judas goes back and tries to give the silver back to the high priests, and they say, sorry, buddy, that's your problem. It is not our problem. And they allow the money to kind of roll on the floor. They do not take the money back. We know that Judas then bought a field, a potter's field, and that was called a field of blood. And then the last thing that we know about Judas is that ultimately, when he saw what happened or was happening to Jesus, that he went and took his own life. And according to the different Gospels in the book of Acts, he hung himself or he fell headlong into a grave in the field. Now, I grew up in the church going to Palm Sunday, Easter, different seasons of my life. And every time I've heard the different stories of Judas, particularly in Holy Week, there have been burning questions. Maybe you have had questions about Judas that you've wondered. Why would they trust this guy with the money if they knew that he was a thief, right? And so maybe the gospel writers knew in retrospect that he was not honest, and maybe he was able to fool them. I don't have any good answers for that, but Judas was trusted but not trustworthy. The other question I've always wondered is, why would Jesus keep Judas close if he knew ahead of time that he would betray him? And so we begin to see that this plot twist of one of Jesus' own, an inside job, is this sort of ordained thing that God takes the human brokenness and it becomes an important part of the story. So is God using Judas? Is God using this person's corrupt motivations and bitterness and evil? Or as the text says, he's possessed by a devil, and yet it becomes a part of the good news. How does that work? Is that fair to Judas that God knows what he's going to do? I've always wrestled with these questions, and they can lead us to theological questions. Does God use evil people on purpose? We're going to get back to that. And why did Judas betray Jesus with a kiss? Why not another sign? And again, if he was known everywhere and crowds followed him, why did Judas have to identify Jesus to the soldiers in the first place? We don't always get answers to these questions. And then particularly when Judas returns the money, I've always wondered, what did Judas want to accomplish? Did he want Jesus to get arrested and executed, as happens by the Romans? Or was he hoping for something else? Then, of course, why did he try and give the money back? When did he get a conscience? When did all of a sudden he become a moral person? Was the outcome different than what he had hoped? And then at the very end, if Jesus is the Messiah, and Judas believes that he had betrayed the real Messiah, why does Judas commit suicide? Why doesn't he see what God can do with the Messiah? Well, perhaps Judas was trying to spur Jesus into taking action. This is something I saw in a dramatic representation in a movie, one of the many movies about the Passion. And Judas, instead of trying to get Jesus arrested to be crucified, Perhaps what Judas is trying to do is that he's trying to do an end run on Jesus and force Jesus' hand. Perhaps he is sick of Jesus talking in parables, messing around, and he believes that Jesus is the Messiah, so he wants to force Jesus to take an action, to make a move to expel the Romans. Perhaps he has lost his patience with the loving Savior and wants him to be like the Zealots, a soldier, a revolutionary. And he thinks that if Jesus gets arrested, then finally he will fight back and take the throne and be the strong leader that Judas has been impatiently waiting for Jesus to be. We never know. But I have always felt that there's something in Judas' actions that he was trying to push Jesus to do what Jesus had been slow to do, to start a holy war, to force his hand, to act like a Messiah, so that Judas could take his rightful place at Jesus' side. It is so important in this story is that Judas is never sent away, never excluded, but whatever he does in impatience, resentment, anger, hatred, in selfishness, whatever his motivations are, God uses them in this story. So there are a couple of observations that I want to share what we learn. First of all, what do we learn about Jesus in this story? Number one, Jesus is true to who he is. Any effort of Judas to change who Jesus is, to get Jesus to stop being so peaceful and to hurry up and be a revolutionary and fight back, no matter what Judas does, Jesus doesn't take the bait. When he's arrested, he doesn't fight back. When he's in front of the priests, he doesn't play their game. When he's taken in front of Pontius Pilate, he has no defense. When he's beaten by the Romans, he doesn't beat back. And when people mock him and spit at him on the cross, tell him to save himself, Jesus never changes who he is, regardless of human attempts to force him to accommodate their wishes. Have you ever really wished that God would handle something differently? You get impatient with God or misunderstanding with God, or wish that God would get rid of an evil person or lift up a hurting good person. This story tells us that Jesus is always true to who he is, regardless of our attempts to manipulate or to control God. The second is that Jesus does not need to exclude people regardless of their failures and betrayals. There is a parable that Jesus says when there is a field sown with wheat and an enemy comes and sows weeds. Jesus says, instead of trying to rip out the weeds among the wheat, you let it all grow. And then when you harvest it, it's easier then to separate the wheat from the chaff. And that is exactly what happens here, is instead of trying to pick Judas out early, prematurely, he allows the fruits to be produced. And Judas kind of removes himself as chaff instead of Jesus having to do it for him. Jesus does not need to exclude people regardless of their failures and betrayers. As a pastor, I have to say, people have come to me all the time with their lists of people that they want me to get rid of or change or fix or exclude. Pastor, if you just wouldn't accept these people, or you wouldn't allow these sort of people to be here, or et cetera, et cetera. And I always think about Jesus. Regardless of who was at the table, Jesus was consistent to who he was. He allowed people to be who they were. And in the end, his grace was sufficient for everyone. The third observation about who Jesus is that God's grace can be hard to fathom or receive. At the end of the story, when Judas sees what's happening to Jesus, he doesn't wait to see what God does. He gives up on himself, because the idea that he could ever be received by his disciples again or his followers, his colleagues, is unthinkable. And so for Judas, he feels that he has no option but to take his own life. There's always an option. And God's grace is so much bigger. But sometimes when we look at our own failures and faults, we can feel there's no way that God could love me, or no way that people could ever forgive me. We shortchange ourselves and we shortchange God. So here are some observations about Judas. Number 1, Judas' impatience and resentment caused him to do an end run on Jesus. He was impatient with what he wanted Jesus to do, and so therefore he stopped waiting and tried to control Jesus. The second is that when our plan fails, like Judas's plan failed, we can underestimate God's ability to transcend and transform. When Judas saw that his plan blew up in his face, and instead of Jesus fighting back, he was going to get executed, Judas gave up, and he underestimated God's ability to intervene. The third observation about Judas is his inability to understand or receive grace was his undoing. The undoing of Judas was not necessarily his betrayal. His undoing was the fact that he did not have faith that God could forgive, love, and redeem him, given what he did. So then, 3 observations for us as followers of Jesus. Know these 3 things. Number 1, God does not need your permission to do what God is going to do. God does not need your permission or timing to do what God is going to do. Number 2, we are called to be instruments of God's work, but we can't force or control God's outcomes. We're called to do God's work, but not God's job. We cannot force outcomes, nor are we responsible for them. We are responsible for our actions and for the next step that we take. And the last thing that Judas teaches us about discipleship is that God's grace is always bigger than our failure, and it can always transform human brokenness. We just have to wait to the end of the story. And the crucifixion is not the end of the story. It's Good Friday, but Easter is coming. Friends, I'm grateful that you have joined us. Let us continue to walk together, to follow Jesus, and to be the church in a hurting world.
Thanks again for listening. For more information about us or anything you heard in this episode, be sure to visit haddonfieldumc.org. Through today's scripture and message, we pray that you find strength to go deeper into love of God and neighbor as we work together to be the church in a hurting world.